Okay, so now that we have an enemy, let's set up different spawners throughout our map so that they are spawned at different times as the waves go by. So I might want to have a spawner here, here, and we'll just pick random positions, and then we'll create an array that keeps reference of these different positions and then starts to spawn randomly different enemies at those different positions. So I'll start by creating an empty game object. I'll call this spawner, and I'll reset its position to the center of the map. And then what I'll do is I'll add a game object beneath it. And I'll start to move these in the different spots I'd like the spawns to occur in. So I'll just copy and paste. So we'll start just with 3 for now, and we'll add more as we go along. And I'm going to quickly rename these as well. So I've renamed them to spawn point. Also, make sure that the spawn points are on the ground and not above it. So we can select all of them and then set their Y to 0. There we go. And now let's create our spawner script. So I started by cleaning up the script. I removed the start and update, and now I'll guide you through what we need in our class to take us to the first phase of spawning. And in our first implementation, we're not going to have waves, we're just going to have one initial spawn, and if that works out, then we're going to move on to waves. So the first thing we need is a reference to our spider prefab once we create it. So let's add that in, and we'll call it enemy. Next, we'll create a class property that gives us reference to a random spawn point. So I've called it random spawn point and set up a get. And then it first sets a local variable of the random index. And we just use Unity's random.range starting with 0. And then what we do is we get the child count by accessing the transform, which is the parent game object. And then we just return the transform.getChild with the random index we just selected. So I'll bring back the start so that for our initial phase, we just spawn them on start since we're not worrying about waves at this point. And then what I do is I loop through the count of spawn points, and I have a quick little debug to let me know it's working. And then I use the instantiate function, and I supply the enemy prefab using the random spawn point position as the position of the spawn. And then I have to supply a rotation. In this case, I just want it to be 0, so I'll supply quaternion.identity. So now in Unity, let's add in the component we just created, spawner. And next we're going to need our enemy prefab, but we don't have one yet. We just have the spider game object. So to quickly create a prefab, as we've done in our first module, we're going to take the spider, and I have renamed it to just spider. And I'm going to drag this into our prefab folder. And now we have a spider prefab. So we can go back to our spawner, component, drag in the spider prefab. And inside Unity, we can now go into the scene and we can check the scene hierarchy and see that we have 3 spiders. And 2 of them seem to have spawned on top of each other, and that's fine. And so far it's working. And so what isn't working is the target. That has not been set yet. And so they're not following me. They're just standing there. And the reason for that is, since it's a prefab knows nothing of the scene since it doesn't exist in the scene. And so we need to create a script that on spawn of the enemy, it sets reference to the player as its target. So let's go ahead and create that now. So back in the spawner script, what I'll do is create a public reference to the player. And then what we'll do is we'll access the component of the enemy we spawned, which is responsible for setting its target. So first let's get reference to the enemy. And then we'll get reference to its component. and we need to cast it as a game object. So then we'll do get component, and we'll get reference to AI follow. And at this point, we can set reference to that component and then set its target to the player. And there's a slight bug, so I'm just going to fix the name. And there we go. So now back in Unity, all we need to do is once our script is done updating, we can drag in the first-person controller into our player. And now when we hit play and go to scene, we can see that all the spiders are moving towards this player. So we should have multiple spiders chasing us. Now you might have noticed that some of the spiders are stuck within each other. So we'll have to offset their spawn position slightly to avoid that. So let's add that to our script now. So back in our script, we know our spawn is working, so I'll get rid of this debug.log and I'll create a variable for position. And then I'll set it to random.inside unit sphere. And I'll add that to our initial spawn position. So that will offset it slightly. And then I'll reset the instantiate position with our new function variable position. Now we risk spawning it under the ground, so one quick fix to that is we have to set position.y equals 0. And I'll also multiply this by 3 so that we get a greater randomness. And just to demonstrate the effect of this, I've set our loop to 20 so that 20 enemies will spawn. And inside Unity, let's see what happens. You can see they are all separated. So now that it's working, let's clean up our script a bit. I'm going to promote this hard-coded value to a class variable. And we'll call it spawn offset. I'll also extract a function out of these two lines, and I'll call it set AI target. Next, I'll fix the name, or I'll fix the return type of this property since it says return spawn point, yet it's returning a transform. So I'll have it return a vector 3 in this case, which actually does represent a point. And over here, I just need to set its position. And then what I'll do, I'll implement this logic into this random spawn point function or property. Now, since we added it into this property, we can then remove this over here and set this directly to random spawn point. And then lastly, I'd like to get rid of this line over here. So what I'm going to do is move this up here, and I'll return position, and then I'll set position dot y to 0 as I had in our start function. But then I can get rid of this, and I can directly call random spawn point in substitute of our position. And there we go.